At Christmas dinner, his own son placed a glass of water in his hand, and within an hour he was standing in the kitchen shaking as he dialed 911. What should have been a night of family warmth turned into the moment he realized he was marked for death. The holiday lights blurred into a nightmare when the truth cut through him like glass. His child had placed a $2 million price on his life. Every heartbeat felt like a countdown, every breath stolen by betrayal. What he uncovered next would shatter every illusion of family. Subscribe now and comment where you're watching from before the rest of this story unfolds. The dining room shimmered like a scene staged for a glossy magazine cover, every detail too immaculate, too curated to be real. The turkey gleamed with a lacquered perfection under the chandelier, each ornament on the towering centerpiece catching the light in a way that made the whole table glow like a theater set. Crystal glasses lined up in military precision, champagne bubbles rising in flawless rhythm as if choreographed for the occasion. His son Nathan lifted his glass. The practiced smile on his face stretched just wide enough to suggest success, but his eyes betrayed nothing but calculation. Beside him, his wife leaned forward with the kind of elegance that was learned, not natural, her laugh sharp and hollow, echoing against the walls like glass about to crack. It was supposed to feel like family, but to him, it was a performance one, with actors who knew their lines too well. He studied their every move, every word, the way Nathan's hand rested on his wife's shoulder, just long enough for the gesture to appear affectionate yet carried the stiffness of someone conscious of an audience. The way she tapped her diamond ring against the stem of her glass was not idle. It was deliberate, a reminder of what they had and what he supposedly didn't. He had sat across from criminals for most of his life, dissecting lies dressed up as truth, and tonight his own son was wearing the costume of a man he had never truly become. The conversation danced with rehearsed ease, mentions of ski trips to Aspen and imported wines as if the very air around them had to be infused with wealth. Every subject was another brushstroke in the portrait of success Nathan and his wife wanted him to see. Yet to him it was a canvas smeared with desperation. He noted the details like entries in a ledger, the watch gleaming too brightly, the car keys on the counter belonging to a Lexus far beyond their means, the designer gown she wore that cost more than half a month's mortgage for an honest man. The arithmetic didn't balance. He could feel it like a hairline crack in glass, invisible to others, but fatal with the right pressure. The air itself seemed to thicken with the scent of roasted meat and pine so heavy it pressed against his chest. He lifted his fork, but couldn't bring himself to take another bite. His gaze lingered on his son's movements, the perfectly timed toast, the mention of the Henderson account, the way he leaned back in his chair, as if holding court in a room full of loyal admirers. But there were no clients here, no partners, only family, and the very performance reeked of something darker than pride. Nathan wasn't just lying. He was flaunting a life cobbled together from debt and pretense, and his wife smiled as though she had already sold the illusion to the highest bidder. He forced a sip of water, the glass trembling in his hand, though he willed it to remain steady. The holiday lights reflected on the surface, bending into warped, fractured stars that seemed to mock the idea of celebration. The chandelier hummed faintly with the electricity running through it, the only reminder that he was still in a house, not on a stage. Across the table, his son's eyes lingered on him longer than they should have, a flicker of something unreadable sparking there. For a moment, the father thought he saw it, the shadow of guilt, a twitch of nerves, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared, swallowed by the grin that stretched his son's face into something unrecognizable. A toast was raised again, this time by the wife. Her voice was silk over steel as she lifted her glass high and declared the evening a triumph of family and fortune. He watched her lips curl around the words with such fluidity that it could have been rehearsed in front of a mirror. And perhaps it had been. Her eyes flickered toward him, measuring his reaction, searching for cracks in his composure. He gave her none. He had long since learned that the first to flinch loses the game. Still beneath the weight of her smile, a gnawing unease burrowed deeper into him. He had seen embezzlers grin, through audits thieves laugh at accusations they knew were true. He knew the signs. Every laugh, every clink of glass, every word spoken across that immaculate table was layered with deceit. It was not the warmth of a family holiday, but the chill of a Kana performance in which he was the intended audience. The heat of the room became oppressive, his collar clinging to the back of his neck as though the air itself was conspiring against him. He loosened his tie discreetly, his fingers brushing against the fabric like a man trying to free himself from a noose. He took in the ornaments again glittering in the centerpiece and saw them for what they were, distractions sparkling enough to blind the casual eye while something darker simmered beneath. His fork rested untouched on the plate, the food before him suddenly lifeless, stripped of all appeal. He looked at his son again and saw not the boy he had raised, but a stranger sculpted out of greed and fear. The laughter, the confidence, the luxury on display. It was all theater, and beneath it he sensed the rot of desperation. It clung to Nathan like a second skin, invisible to those who wanted to believe in the show, but obvious to a man who had built his life exposing frauds. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it should have, each second dragging with it a reminder that he was no longer sitting in the safety of his home, but in the middle of a carefully staged deception. His unease sharpened into suspicion, his suspicion into dread. He could feel the storm pressing at the edges of the night, waiting to break through the glitter and gold of that dining room. He had no proof yet, only instinct sharpened by decades of truth-seeking. But instinct was enough to whisper one undeniable truth into his mind. Something was coming, something hidden beneath their flawless act. And when it revealed itself, it would not be small. It would shatter everything. He pressed his napkin onto the table slowly, his hand steady, though his pulse thundered beneath his skin. His smile matched theirs, now thin and practiced, concealing the suspicion that had already taken root. They thought the performance had him fooled. They thought the act was seamless. But as he lifted his glass once more, his eyes never left Nathan's, and in that moment the son smiled too brightly, too confidently, and the father knew. The lie was close to breaking, and when it did, the shards would cut deeper than anyone at that table could imagine. What he would uncover next would turn the perfect dinner into a crime scene, and the family toast into the prelude of betrayal. Years spent dissecting ledgers and unraveling corporate fraud had sharpened his vision beyond the reach of ordinary men. Numbers never lied, people did. And tonight, as Nathan bragged about his latest business venture, about the luxury condo downtown, and the so-called deal that had doubled his investment overnight, the father felt the same chill he used to feel when a balance sheet didn't add up. He sat silently, fingers brushing the edge of his glass, the memory cutting through the polished laughter like a blade. $50,000. He had given Nathan that sum less than 6 months ago, not as a gift but as a lifeline. His son had come to him, desperate voice cracking on the phone, insisting it was a temporary setback. That money had been meant to keep him afloat, not to fund champagne toasts and designer gowns. And yet here Nathan sat spinning tales of prosperity as though he had never known hardship. The father let his eyes wander, cataloging the scene as if it were evidence in a case. The watch on Nathan's wrist gleaming too brightly, a limited edition worth more than most men's yearly salary. The Lexus key fob placed strategically on the counter as if it had accidentally slipped from his pocket. His wife's necklace heavy with stones that caught the light like fire, almost daring him to question its authenticity. Each object screamed of excess, but together they whispered something else: debt, desperation, and deceit wrapped in luxury's disguise. He had seen executives build empires on lies, stacking loans atop hollow investments, until the entire structure collapsed. This, he thought, was no different. The same architecture of fraud, only closer to home. His disappointment ran deeper than anger. Numbers could be corrected, debts repaid, reputations rebuilt. But this was his son, the boy he had once carried on his shoulders at county fairs, the boy who used to count quarters in a jar with wide-eyed wonder. How had that child grown into this man who thought deception could pass for success? The father sipped his drink, masking the bitterness with a smile, though inside he felt the sting of betrayal heavier than any financial fraud he had ever uncovered. Nathan's voice grew louder as the wine flowed, his words weaving a tapestry of wealth and triumph. He spoke of a partnership in Dallas, of property in Florida, of vacations already booked to Maui. Every syllable was a brushstroke painting him as the man he wanted the room to see. But beneath the colors, the father recognized the smudges. He remembered the overdue mortgage notice Nathan had slipped into his mailbox by mistake, the bank's letterhead glaring in bold. He remembered the hushed phone calls late at night when his son thought no one was listening, talking to creditors with a tone not of power but of panic. He turned his gaze to the wife, her laugh cutting through the air like crystal breaking. She leaned into every story, nodding with rehearsed pride, her hand gliding over Nathan's arm as though to reinforce the illusion. Yet her eyes betrayed her. They darted too quickly when he mentioned the condo, lingered too long on his reaction when Nathan boasted about the stock portfolio. She was complicit but also fearful, as if she knew the performance was fragile and one wrong word would shatter the glass. The father folded his napkin carefully, an old habit from long nights of interrogations where patience was the sharpest weapon. He had seen men confess to embezzlement not because he accused them, but because he waited silent until their own guilt forced them to fill the air. Tonight he would play the same game. Nathan's laughter rang hollow in his ears, but he let it continue, nodding at the right time, smiling where politeness required. All the while his mind was tallying the evidence, drawing lines between debts and boasts, truth and lies. He thought back to that $50,000 again. The way Nathan had stood in his study, shoulders slumped, insisting he just needed a push to get back on track. The father had believed him, or perhaps he had wanted to believe him. Because belief was easier than admitting his only son had learned to manipulate not just strangers, but him. And now, seeing the charade unfold across the dinner table, he realized that money had not been used to rebuild it, had been used to mask the cracks. The disappointment twisted deeper, not just in his chest, but in his very bones. It wasn't about the money. It never had been. It was about respect, about honesty, about the bond between father and son that should have stood stronger than any lie. And as he watched Nathan's grin widen with every false victory, he felt the fracture between them spread thin at first, then deeper, threatening to break entirely. The room seemed to close in around him, the golden glow of the chandelier turning harsh, unforgiving. He saw not warmth, but interrogation lights exposing truths that everyone else ignored. He wondered if the others at the table noticed the inconsistencies, or if they were too blinded by the shine of wealth to care. He doubted they cared. They laughed, they toasted, they praised Nathan's success with eager voices, unaware or unwilling to see the rot beneath the surface. But he saw it. He couldn't unsee it. Every boast was another crack, every laugh another tremor in the foundation. He knew what came next. Structures built on lies eventually collapsed, often, suddenly, often violently. He had witnessed it in boardrooms and courtrooms, in families torn apart by greed. And now, for the first time, he realized he was not the investigator, but the victim seated at a table where the fraud was not a stranger's, but his own son's. His hand tightened around his glass knuckles, pale under the weight of his restraint. He wanted to call it out, to tear through the performance with the blunt force of truth. But instinct told him to wait, to watch, to let the illusion continue until it revealed itself fully. Because it would. Lies always did. They unraveled at the seams, and once the first thread was pulled, the whole fabric collapsed. The father leaned back slowly, matching Nathan's posture, letting his own expression mirror the ease of a man entertained by tales of success. Inside his mind was a storm, calculating, dissecting, preparing. The doubt had settled into certainty. Now his son was not celebrating success. He was disguising failure and perhaps something far worse. The father's disappointment had transformed into vigilance, every detail logged, every inconsistency marked. And as the laughter carried on, echoing through the house like a chorus of fools cheering a doomed performance, the father sat in silence, a predator biding his time. He knew the truth was close, pressing at the edges of the night, waiting to break free. And when it did, it would not simply expose Nathan's lies. It would reveal the kind of betrayal no father should ever have to face. The ache came quietly, a whisper beneath the hum of laughter and clinking glasses. But soon it spread like a slow fire across his chest. He shifted in his chair, forcing a smile as the edges of the chandelier blurred above him, the light refracting into sharp, jagged shapes. The scent of roasted turkey and spiced cider turned sour in his throat, each breath suddenly heavier, each swallow a chore. His fork clattered softly against the plate, and Nathan's voice cut through the haze. "Are you okay, Dad?" The question was too smooth, too practiced, carrying a hint of performance instead of genuine worry. The father met his son's eyes and saw no flicker of panic, only an unsettling calm that chilled him more than the pain itself. He nodded stiffly, pressing a hand against the table to steady himself. The polished wood felt cool under his palm, grounding him for a moment as the ache pulsed deeper, radiating into his arm. His body betrayed him with its weakness, but his mind stayed sharp, latching onto every detail. Nathan leaned back slightly, his expression arranged into the perfect mask of concern, but his posture remained relaxed, as though he were rehearsing empathy rather than feeling it. His wife's glance was quicker, darting toward him, and then away again, her lips tightening into the faintest smile before she caught herself. He recognized that look. It wasn't fear, it was anticipation. The ache sharpened, turning from a dull throb into a blade twisting beneath his ribs. He steadied his breathing, refusing to let the discomfort show more than it already had. He had interrogated men under fluorescent lights who cracked at the first sign of pressure. He would not give his son the same satisfaction. Instead, he reached for his glass sipping water that suddenly tasted metallic, as though the liquid itself was laced with suspicion. The rim pressed cold against his lips, and for the first time that evening, the room seemed to tilt slightly, as if the ground itself were questioning his balance. Around him, the chatter continued. Guests raised toasts, laughter bubbled, and music drifted faintly from the living room stereo. The world carried on as though nothing had shifted yet to him. Everything had. The ache was not random. It was not age or chance or the inevitability of a tired heart. No, it carried the weight of intention, a design hidden beneath the glitter of the evening. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, long enough to feel the pulse hammering against his temple, then opened them to find Nathan watching him too closely, his smile still fixed in place. Memories bled into the edges of his thoughts. Long hours in the office, poring over columns of figures that never quite balanced the moment when the wrong entry exposed an entire scheme. This was the same. His body was the ledger now, and the numbers weren't adding up. Something foreign moved through his veins, cold and deliberate, and the son who once begged him for help now sat across the table, waiting to see the result. The father's disappointment hardened into dread, not for the possibility of death, but for the realization that the betrayal was deeper than he had allowed himself to believe. He dabbed at his mouth with a napkin, slow and deliberate, buying himself time. Each breath came with effort, shallow, but measured, his lungs straining against the weight pressing down on his chest. He straightened in his chair, refusing to slump, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him falter. His eyes drifted to the wine bottle at the center of the table, its label turned outward like an advertisement, pristine and expensive. He had not touched it yet. The ache throbbed harder with each sip of water. And then the thought struck him like a hammer. It wasn't the wine. It was the glass already in his hand. Nathan reached forward, then laying a hand over his wrist with just the right pressure, the kind meant to mimic concern. "Dad, maybe you should lie down for a bit." The words were soft, measured, but underneath them the father heard the subtext. "Stay quiet. Don't make a scene. Let it happen." He pulled his wrist back, forcing a thin smile that didn't touch his eyes. "No, I'm fine," he said, though the ache was now a steady drumbeat beneath his sternum. His refusal hung in the air like smoke, and for the briefest moment he saw something flicker across Nathan's face, frustration sharp and unguarded before the mask returned. The room swayed again, the sounds of laughter and clinking silverware distorting into echoes. He clenched his jaw, grounding himself in the one skill he trusted most, observation. He noted the way Nathan's wife poured herself another glass of wine without offering him any, the way her hand trembled slightly as she set the bottle back down. He noted the way Nathan's eyes flickered to the clock on the wall as though counting minutes. These weren't the actions of people enjoying a holiday dinner. These were the movements of conspirators waiting for a conclusion. A bead of sweat slipped down his temple, chilling as it met the cool air. He adjusted his cuff, hiding the tremor in his hand, and forced another bite of food, though the taste turned to ash on his tongue. He had learned long ago that survival sometimes meant blending into the performance, wearing the mask, until the moment came to strip it from the others. And so he played along, nodding at jokes, lifting his glass when expected, all the while feeling the ache grow heavier, sharper, more insistent. The dread coiled tighter inside him, but so did resolve. If this was what he suspected, then tonight was not about celebration, it was about survival. He felt the weakness crawling through him, but behind it burned something stronger, colder, the instinct of a man who had fought battles in boardrooms and courtrooms and never lost when the truth was on his side. He would not lose now, not to his own blood. He leaned back slightly, disguising the motion as comfort, while his eyes swept the room one last time. He took in the champagne flutes, the glittering ornaments, the carefully staged perfection that suddenly felt more like a coffin than a celebration. The ache in his chest was no longer just a symptom. It was a warning. And he knew with certainty that if he didn't act, if he didn't uncover what was behind this performance, the night would end, not in laughter, but in silence. The father let the smile linger on his lips as he raised his glass once more. But inside, every nerve screamed the same truth. Someone at this table had already chosen his last toast. What he discovered next would prove just how deep their betrayal went, and how far they were willing to go to erase him. The kitchen was quieter than the dining room, the muffled sound of laughter and clinking glasses leaking through the swinging door like echoes from another world. He stepped across the tiled floor, his chest still heavy, his breathing shallow but steady. He had come here under the pretense of rinsing his hands, of collecting himself, but what awaited him in that silence was not relief. His hand brushed the edge of the counter, and in the motion a stack of papers slipped loose, sliding to the floor with a soft scatter. He crouched slowly, his pulse hammering, and gathered the bills one by one. But then his eyes froze. A sheet of paper stared back at him with words printed in bold, clean lines that cut through his chest sharper than the pain already there. His name. His own name printed across the top of the page. A life insurance policy. $2 million. His hands trembled as he traced the details, the beneficiary line screaming louder than any voice in the next room. Nathan. His son. The ache in his chest deepened, but now it was more than physical. It was fury, hot and corrosive, flooding his veins. The document was recent. Too recent, dated only weeks before this evening. The father knew the weight of signatures, the way they carried truth or deception. He had signed thousands in his career, each one binding a story, a contract, a life. And now here he was, staring at his own death reduced to a transaction. The edges of the paper blurred as his vision sharpened with rage. It was no longer suspicion. It was no longer doubt. It was betrayal in ink, betrayal that carried a price tag and an expiration date. His son had prepared for this. Carefully. Coldly. The fake smiles, the hollow concern, the rehearsed empathy. They were all pieces of a plan that ended with his body in the ground and Nathan holding the payout. He clutched the document tighter, his knuckles whitening, the veins in his hand rising like cords pulled too taut. The kitchen light hummed above him, flickering once as though the room itself was recoiling from the truth. He slid the paper back into the stack, careful, precise, as though handling evidence that could not be disturbed. His training had returned instinctively, control the scene record. The details never let the suspect know you've uncovered the crime. His breaths grew calmer, colder. The fear that had gripped him at the table was gone, now burned away by a sharper fire. Rage had taken its place, but not the wild, uncontrollable kind. This was rage honed into precision, the same weapon he had wielded against criminals who thought they were cleverer than the system. He straightened slowly, placing the papers back exactly as they had fallen, aligning the corners with the care of a man who knew every detail mattered. His eyes scanned the room, cataloging it the way he would a crime scene. The half-empty wine bottle on the counter, the dirty glasses stacked too neatly beside the sink, the faint scent of chemicals that didn't belong in a kitchen, lingering beneath the aroma of roasted meat. He opened the drawer nearest to him, pretending to search for napkins, but instead found a small vial tucked against the side. Its cap was loose, the residue along its rim faint but unmistakable. He lifted it to the light, tilting it just enough to see the crystallized trace clinging to the glass. The ache in his chest pulsed again, sharper now, and for the first time he knew with certainty what coursed through his body. It wasn't age. It wasn't coincidence. It was poison. His own son had placed the glass in his hand. His own son had staged the perfect family evening, and now his own son was waiting for him to collapse quietly to make it all look natural. His fingers closed around the vial, slipping it into his pocket with practiced ease. Evidence. Proof. The betrayal was no longer just suspicion or theory. It was tangible, heavy, a piece of glass carrying the truth of his son's intent. He glanced at the swinging door. Beyond it, laughter still rang, cheerful, oblivious, cruel in its contrast. He forced his shoulders to straighten, his breathing to slow. He could not stumble back into that room as a victim. No, he had to wear his own mask now. The mask of compliance, the mask of a man who had seen nothing. Nathan would not know, not yet. His eyes drifted once more to the insurance document, and the rage sharpened into something colder, something steadier. For years he had built cases against men who thought they could outsmart the numbers, twist the truth into something profitable. They always underestimated the quiet man in the corner, the one who asked too few questions but remembered every answer. Tonight, Nathan had underestimated the wrong man. He stepped back from the counter, the vial pressing against the inside of his pocket like a secret heartbeat. The walls of the kitchen seemed closer now, the hum of the light above, harsher, the air itself, heavy with the weight of revelation. He moved toward the door, each step deliberate, the mask already sliding into place. To the others he would look composed, unchanged. To Nathan he would appear fooled. But inside, a storm was gathering, cold and unstoppable. The dining room awaited on the other side of the swinging door, its golden glow and hollow laughter hiding the rot beneath. He pushed it open slowly, the sound of hinges blending seamlessly into the music. His eyes found Nathan instantly, the smile still plastered across his face, the performance still flawless. But now the father saw it for what it was, not pride, not success, but the grin of a man who thought he had already won. The father slid back into his chair, his hand brushing the edge of his glass with deliberate calm. He raised it slightly, his smile matching Nathan's. The ache in his chest still throbbed, but now it was no longer just pain. It was a reminder, a steady drumbeat of rage held in check. He sipped once more, his eyes never leaving his son's. The act continued, but the stage had shifted. The hunter believed he had set the trap, but the prey had just uncovered it. The father's mind was already moving, sharp and relentless, piecing together every detail into a blueprint for what came next. He would not strike tonight. Not yet. But when he did, it would not be with anger's chaos. It would be with precision, with patience, with the kind of justice that left scars deeper than prison bars. And as the laughter swelled around the table, he leaned back, hiding his fury behind the mask of a smile. The betrayal had been uncovered, the plot revealed, and his rage was no longer a weakness. It was a weapon. What came after this night would not be forgiveness. It would be something Nathan could never escape. The discovery in that kitchen had changed everything, and the storm it unleashed was only just beginning. The glass sat where he had left it, beads of condensation sliding down its side like sweat down a guilty brow. His reflection trembled faintly in the water, fractured by the shifting light from the chandelier beyond the swinging door. Next to it, almost hidden against the polished counter, lay the vial. Small, unremarkable, the kind of thing most people would never notice. But he did. A thin ring of residue clung to the inside, pale and crystalline, catching the kitchen light like frost on glass. In that instant his mind snapped the puzzle together with a clarity that made his stomach drop. He wasn't ill, he wasn't weak, he wasn't tired, he was being poisoned. The realization hit like ice water down his spine, freezing every nerve before igniting a slow burning terror that pulsed with each beat of his heart. His fingers hovered above the counter for a fraction of a second before curling into a fist, a silent act of control. The ache in his chest, the metallic taste in his mouth, the rehearsed concern in Nathan's eyes, all of it lined up now like figures in a ledger. Nothing random, nothing accidental. This was deliberate, planned. His son had poured death into a glass and handed it to him with a smile. He slid the vial into his palm, feeling its coldness seep into his skin. It was lighter than it looked, but it carried the weight of betrayal heavier than any case he'd ever handled. His pulse drummed in his ears louder than the muffled music from the dining room. He glanced at the door, at the faint outline of shadows moving beyond it, and forced himself to breathe slowly, evenly. No sudden movements, no signs of panic. Nathan couldn't know he'd discovered it, not yet. He took one last look at the glass, at the half-inch of water left shimmering at the bottom. The idea of how close he had come made his vision darken at the edges. A single sip more. A few minutes longer. He pressed his tongue to the roof of his mouth, tasting the metallic tang. Still there, a ghost of what had been inside the vial. His mind replayed the evening in reverse, each detail sharpened now by the truth. Nathan placing the glass near his hand without asking. Nathan's wife turning her back too quickly when he reached for it. The subtle glances between them, the way they measured his every movement. He stepped back from the counter and steadied himself, one hand gripping the edge of the sink to keep his knees from buckling. The kitchen's soft hum grew louder, oppressive, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. He imagined the scene beyond the door, Nathan and his wife laughing with the guests, clinking glasses, waiting for him to falter, to clutch his chest and collapse, just another tragic story of an aging father overcome at Christmas dinner. But he wasn't going to collapse. Not yet. He was still standing still, breathing, and now he had evidence. The vial pressed against his palm like a heartbeat, grounding him, hardening his resolve. The fear was still there, crawling cold and slick through his veins, but beneath it a new force was taking shape. Precision, control, the instinct of a man who had seen predators corner themselves before they even realized it. He set the glass back down exactly where it had been, aligning it with the edge of the counter as if nothing had been disturbed. He tucked the vial into his jacket pocket, the motion slow, unremarkable, rehearsed. Every movement calculated to leave the performance intact. He splashed water on his face from the tap, letting the coolness mask the heat rising under his skin. When he looked up into the dark window over the sink, his reflection stared back at him, a man pale, shaken, but not broken. The father drew a long breath and exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders once to loosen the tension. His chest still hurt, but the ache had changed. It was no longer the helpless pain of a victim, but the steady reminder of how close the blade had come. Beyond the door, the music swelled and laughter rose again. They thought the story was nearly over. They thought the act was complete, but the curtain hadn't dropped yet. He reached for a dish towel and wiped his hands, buying himself a few more seconds to think. He needed to get out to call someone, but not yet. Not before he was sure. A move too early would tip his hand. A move too late could cost him his life. He pictured the policy hidden under the stack of bills, the signatures that bound it, the number scrawled across the page like a death sentence. $2 million. Enough to erase debts, enough to start over, enough to make his absence look like an accident worth profiting from. His gaze drifted back to the door. The shadows on the other side shifted again, and he caught a glimpse of Nathan's profile laughing at something unseen. It was the same laugh he remembered from boyhood, but twisted, now hollow, a sound learned rather than felt. The father's throat tightened. There would be no going back from this moment. The son he had raised, the boy he had believed in, was gone. In his place sat a man who had just tried to kill him. The ache in his chest throbbed once more, but he forced it down, gripping the edge of the counter until his knuckles blanched. He straightened, smoothing his jacket with deliberate calm. The predator had revealed himself. Now it was the prey's turn to play the part until the trap could be sprung. He turned toward the door. His steps slow measured, each one a rehearsal for the mask he would wear when he walked back into the glow of the dining room. The smell of roasted meat clung to his clothes, mingling with the faint chemical scent of the vial now hidden in his pocket. He would sit down again, lift his glass, and let them believe everything was proceeding according to their plan. But inside, every nerve was awake, every instinct sharpened. As his hand pushed against the door, he paused for a fraction of a second, his pulse steady despite the poison coursing through him. He had uncovered the truth, but the truth alone wasn't enough. He needed the right moment, the right move, the strike that would turn their scheme inside out. The kitchen had given him clarity. The next room would demand performance. He let the door swing open slowly, the light from the dining room spilling over him warm and false. Nathan looked up, his smile ready, his eyes searching for signs of weakness. The father smiled back, a thin, controlled curve of the lips, and stepped through. The game had shifted. They didn't know it yet, but the man they thought they'd poisoned had just begun to hunt them. What happened after this night would not be quick, and it would not be quiet. He slid the vial into his pocket as if it were nothing more than a loose coin, and smoothed his shirt with a calm that belonged to another man, the man who had spent decades coaxing confessions out of numbers and witnesses alike. Panic was a luxury he could not afford. Spectacle was the enemy of proof. He inhaled, tasted the faint chemical ghost that clung to his lips, let the warmth of the kitchen wash over him one last time, and then walked back through the swinging door as if he had only gone to fetch a napkin. The mask settled in place, the polite smile, the small jokes, the grandfather who appreciated tradition. Nathan greeted him with that same practiced warmth and slid back into the role he had rehearsed all evening, oblivious to the fact that the man he meant to break had already changed the rules of the game. Every move he made after that was measured to the millimeter. He spoke in short sentences, letting other people fill the air with sound while he listened for slips and rhythms. Where others would have raised their voices, he kept his low and steady, letting his son's words hang like fruit ripe for the plucking. He let the conversation wander toward money and success, toward the Henderson account, toward Aspen ski trips and luxury cars, because lies build their own scaffolding and they always lean into the light. He noticed more than he let on the way Nathan's fingers flexed when the subject turned to creditors, the way his wife's eyes flicked to the silverware as if timing mattered. Every imperfection in their performance was a seam he could pull. He found small, unobtrusive ways to collect what he needed while keeping the show intact. A napkin folded just so, a glass repositioned within reach, a casual request to check on the evening roast that let him step close enough to brush the counter with his coat sleeve and feel for the small sticky residue that might prove the vial's contents. He touched nothing that would alter the scene. He only observed and recorded with the kind of precision that had put embezzlers behind bars. He let his phone sit on the table face down within easy reach, the screen an unblinking witness, its voice memo app armed and waiting for a slip. He did not record yet. Timing mattered. A confession snatched too soon could crumble under cross-examination. A confession coaxed just right would be a gift. Under the chandelier's staged glow, he drank sparingly, letting the water rinse only what he wanted it to, and leaving the rest as evidence. He smiled at relatives, accepted compliments, and suppressed the urge to tear the room apart. The drama would be quieter, more devastating if it arrived like a ledger entry that couldn't be disputed. He cataloged receipts in his head as he watched faces making mental lists of what to demand and what to conceal until the time came. The $50,000 he had given months ago was a line item. The words Nathan used to describe it tonight were a pattern. He could deduce 1,000 ways that money had been spent, misdirected, laundered, simply by listening to tone and timeline. It was the old work repurposed for the most personal case of his life. He let them speak of logistics, dates, vendors, the name of a car dealership spoken to casually. Each proper noun could become an anchor to pull on later. He let the wife recount the story of a supposed business venture with an offhand laugh, then repeated a portion of it verbatim at a later time, as if by accident, watching for how their voices shifted when they thought they were in the clear. He watched Nathan's pupils dilate when the conversation touched on insurance and inheritance, watched the reflexive tightening of his jaw when someone mentioned his father's health. Those small physical tells were worth more than any shouted accusation had ever been. He staged mild confusion on purpose, letting himself appear a touch weaker, the lines at the corners of his eyes deeper as if age alone had finally caught up. The tactic was simple and brutal. Make them comfortable in their cruelty. Let their arrogance swell, keep them believing that a fragile father could be bullied into silence. He would not expose the vial yet. He would not call the police. He would allow them the luxury of thinking him broken, because cruelty performed for an audience often slips into confession when nobody expects to be overheard. Between courses, he excused himself to the powder room not to hide, but to compose. The mirror offered a brief, honest glance, a man whose face had mapped the contours of a lifetime spent reading lies. He placed a light cloth inside his jacket, tucking the vial deeper, and paused to send 3 short, careful text messages, one to a lawyer who had once told him that timing wins cases, one to an old colleague who owed him a favor in toxicology labs, one to his bank with a curt line about freezing certain accounts pending review. He did not say why. He did not yet need to. Each ping was a strategic seed and insurance policy pressed into motion that he would harvest only when the right moment arrived. Back at the table, he used kindness as a blade, sharpening his questions into soft, seemingly innocent probes. "Tell me about that investment," he murmured at one point, not accusing, only curious. He let his voice carry the memory of the night he had given the $50,000 the place it had been wired from the account name Nathan had used. He phrased his curiosity like a father worried about his son's future, and watched as the guilty flinched. Nathan answered in practiced tones, offering half-truths and taut explanations that revealed more than he intended. He watched faces track micro-expressions, let their discomfort be the proof that would undercut their performance in front of a jury. Every so often he allowed a flash of hurt to cross his features, just enough to be believable, not enough to become a spectacle. Grief would serve him here. The juxtaposition of sorrow and composure made him more credible to outsiders, more dangerous to the conspirators who counted on him being merely old and forgetful. It was a bitter calculation, using the language of vulnerability to weaponize their contempt against them. He felt the moral weight of that choice settle like a stone. He was playing a long game, but he was not without remorse. He remembered the small boy who once clung to his hand in supermarket aisles, the teenager who had fumbled through first jobs. That memory made the betrayal worse, sharpened the focus of his resolve. As plates were cleared and the hour grew late, he allowed himself one private smile, not of victory, but of acknowledgement that the first move had been his. He had not reacted with fear. He had acted with discipline. He had concealed the vial, preserved the scene, and kept the actors performing long enough that they would reveal the architecture of their lies. The work ahead would be messy subpoenas, bank records, interviews conducted with the chill of courtrooms. But the initial advantage was his. He had turned their confidence into a liability. When the dessert course arrived, the room's laughter swelled louder for the relief of all who believed the story was over. He took a small bite of pie, small and deliberate tasting cinnamon, and the thin veneer of normalcy. He sipped his coffee and let the warmth trickle down, steadying him. He let Nathan hold on to his illusions a while longer. Pride was a dangerous thing. It makes men careless. He intended to use that carelessness until it cost them everything. He rose finally, smiling and steady, and thanked the host for a lovely evening. The family murmured validation, small compliments that felt sincere only because they were rehearsed. He hugged his daughter-in-law and patted Nathan's shoulder with a practiced affection, a gesture that might pass for ordinary to anyone who wasn't watching the room for patterns. He stepped outside into a cold December night and breathed deeply, feeling the sting of the air in his lungs and the steady drum of purpose in his chest. He did not go home to sleep. He went to plan. In the parked car, he removed the vial from his pocket once more and held it up to the dashboard light, letting its tiny shadow stretch across paper receipts he had hidden in his wallet. He thought through the sequence: evidence preservation, toxicology, confirmation, bank subpoenas. The quiet invitation he would extend to his son and daughter-in-law under the guise of reconciliation. He imagined the meeting room, the gleam of a mahogany table, the sound of a lawyer's voice reading clauses designed to snap like steel. He imagined Nathan's face when the trap closed the moment confidence buckled into comprehension. He closed his hand around the vial and tucked it back into his jacket, feeling its chill like a solemn promise. The night was far from over. The dinner had been the stage. Now the investigation would be the instrument. He walked slowly to his car, each step measured, each breath a slow metronome. The world behind him remained blissfully ignorant, lights, twinkling laughter trailing through the house, unaware that the man they thought they had nearly silenced was already composing the ledger that would bring them down. What followed would not be swift, and it would not be loud. It would be meticulous, inevitable, and utterly devastating. The road stretched ahead in a blur of asphalt and flickering headlights, each beam slicing through the darkness like a blade. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, leather creaking under his palms, the faint sting in his chest echoing with every mile. The night should have been quiet, a drive home after family dinner, but every headlight he passed felt like a predator's gaze, every shadow on the shoulder like a figure waiting to pounce. His jacket pocket was heavy, weighted by glass no bigger than a thumb. The vial pressed against his ribs with each turn of the wheel, a constant reminder that his son had not only betrayed him, but tried to erase him to trade his life for a payout dressed in zeros. He kept his eyes fixed on the road, though his mind replayed the evening in brutal detail. Nathan's smile, so polished and hollow, the forced concern as he asked if his father felt well. The wife's laughter that curdled into silence when she thought no one noticed, every moment replayed like a reel of evidence each second, another nail in the coffin of their charade. He thought of the glass of water, innocent in its simplicity, turned into a weapon by the hands of his own blood. Betrayal had many faces, but this was its cruelest, a son who once reached for protection, now reaching for his father's death. The tires hummed over the pavement, steady and relentless. Street lights came and went, casting long shadows across the hood of his car. He glanced at the rear-view mirror, half expecting headlights to follow too closely, a tail sent to ensure the plan's completion. But the road behind was empty, a stretch of black swallowing his fear. The real enemy wasn't on the road, it was already in his bloodstream, already in his house, already carrying his name. Grief gnawed at him as he drove, a grief so raw it burned hotter than the poison. He remembered Nathan as a boy chasing a baseball across the yard, grinning with a gap-toothed smile, calling out for his father's praise. That memory collided with the image of the man at the table boasting of wealth, plotting murder over dinner rolls and cranberry sauce. It was the kind of grief that carved out something hollow inside him, a wound that would never quite heal. But grief was a luxury, too. Focus was what kept his hands steady on the wheel, what kept his eyes sharp against the pull of exhaustion. He rolled down the window slightly, the December air cutting into the cabin cold and bracing. It cleared the haze in his head, sharpened his thoughts into something clean and deliberate. The poison had not yet finished its work, but neither had he. He was still alive, and as long as breath filled his lungs, he had the power to fight. The air carried the faint scent of pine from the woods along the highway, mingling with the metallic tang still lingering on his tongue. Life and death, betrayal and resolve, grief and vengeance, all of it converged in that cold night wind. Every intersection he passed, every green light that carried him forward, felt like a choice. He could turn left toward the hospital, stumble in with a pocket full of evidence, place his fate in the hands of strangers. Or he could continue home, gather his strength, and move pieces on the board with the precision that had defined his career. He chose the latter. A hospital might save his body, but it would not expose his son. That task belonged to him alone. The dashboard clock glowed faintly each minute, pulling him farther from the house where betrayal had been served on fine china. He thought of the vial again, of its slick glass surface and the signature on the insurance document. Together they were the story Nathan had written in secret. But now that story was in his pocket, and he would be the one to choose the ending. Isolation pressed in as the miles stretched. There was no one to call at this hour, no voice to steady him but his own. The loneliness cut sharper because it wasn't supposed to be like this. Old age should have brought family grandchildren the reward of years of sacrifice. Instead, he drove through the night with poison in his blood and betrayal in his heart. But even in isolation, a new strength rose. He had uncovered the truth, and the truth was his weapon. The headlights of an oncoming truck flared bright, forcing him to squint, and for a moment he imagined what it would be like to let go of the wheel, to end it all in a flash of twisted steel. But he tightened his grip, jaw clenched. No. That would be too easy for them. He would not hand them victory. He would not die quietly on the side of a highway while Nathan collected his check. He would live long enough to watch the illusion collapse around his son, long enough to hear the clink of handcuffs and see the mask rip away. The road narrowed into 2 lanes bordered by dark pines. He remembered driving this stretch with Nathan years ago, the boy leaning out the window laughing as the wind whipped across his face. That memory felt like another life belonging to another father, another son. He swallowed hard, forcing the ache of nostalgia into something colder. That boy was gone. The man who remained was nothing but a predator cloaked in bloodline. The closer he came to home, the sharper his focus grew. The isolation transformed into clarity. He had what he needed: the vial, the document, the memory of every false smile and careless word. Together they formed a case stronger than any ledger he'd ever balanced. All he had to do was survive the night, stay alive long enough to strike when the time was right. The house came into view at last, porch light glowing against the darkness. The same light his late wife had insisted on leaving lit, so no one ever came home to shadows. He pulled into the driveway, cut the engine, and sat for a moment in silence. The night was still, the world quiet, but inside his chest the storm raged on. He touched the vial through his jacket, feeling its presence like a second heartbeat. It was proof. It was leverage. It was survival. He stepped out into the cold air. Every sound amplified: the crunch of gravel under his shoes, the creak of the front steps, the whisper of wind against bare branches. He unlocked the door, stepped into the silence of his home, and closed it softly behind him. The warmth of the house wrapped around him, but it was no comfort. He walked to his study, set the vial carefully on the desk, and lowered himself into the leather chair that had carried him through decades of long nights and hard truths. The betrayal was no longer just a thought gnawing at the edges of his mind. It was real, it was tangible, and it had a price written in black ink. He leaned back, closed his eyes for a brief moment, and let the grief wash over him like a tide. Then he opened them, sharp and steady. Isolation had given him focus. Grief had given him fuel, and the evidence in front of him had given him purpose. The lonely drive home had carried him from fear into resolve, from betrayal into strategy. Tomorrow the plan would begin. And when it did, Nathan would learn that the man he tried to poison had not only survived, but had chosen to fight back with a precision that no amount of money could escape. The night after the dinner he barely slept. The poison still churned in his veins, but he fought through the nausea and the lingering ache with the same discipline that had carried him through years of forensic work. The vial sat on his desk beneath the lamplight, gleaming like a shard of truth, and beside it lay the insurance policy he had pulled from the kitchen bills. Together they were more damning than any confession. He sat in his leather chair, the one molded by decades of long nights and harder truths, and let the silence of the house sharpen his mind. Grief was still there, heavy and raw, but now it had been joined by something else: purpose. At dawn he made his first call. The man on the other end was an old friend, a lawyer whose voice carried the same steady edge it had in courtrooms 30 years ago. There were no pleasantries, no wasted words, only the quiet understanding between two men who had spent lifetimes in the pursuit of proof. He explained enough to make the danger clear, his words clipped, controlled. The lawyer didn't question him. Instead, he told him to come in immediately to bring everything he had. By the time the sun climbed fully over the horizon, he was driving into the city, the vial wrapped in cloth inside his coat pocket, the policy locked in his briefcase. The law office smelled faintly of old wood and ink, a place where strategy had been built for decades. His friend spread the papers across the table, scanning each one with the precision of a surgeon. The numbers, the dates, the signatures, they told the story more damning than any testimony. When he produced the vial sealed now in a small evidence bag, the lawyer's eyes narrowed with professional recognition. He promised to run it through contacts at a private lab off the record fast. "If it's what you think it is," he said, "we'll have proof that no one can ignore." The medical tests came next. He scheduled an appointment under a different name, avoiding the hospital closest to his neighborhood. He told the doctor only part of the story, enough to order the blood work enough to demand toxicology. The results trickled back within 48 hours, each one another nail in the coffin of Nathan's defense. Elevated levels of a substance no ordinary man should carry in his bloodstream, traces that matched the residue in the vial almost perfectly. Science doesn't lie, he thought, not when it's measured, recorded, and sealed. Piece by piece the case took form. He gathered bank statements Nathan had carelessly left in his house months earlier, papers filled with red flags, missed payments, overdrawn accounts, reckless loans. He made copies of every letter, every overdue notice he had intercepted. He traced the timeline of the $50,000, the way it vanished into thin air and left only luxury purchases behind. The ledger was building itself, and in it, Nathan was not the son he had raised, but the suspect he was prosecuting. His study became a war room. The desk piled with documents, the corkboard filling with notes and threads of connection, red ink circling dates that matched too neatly to be coincidence. He mapped it all: the night of the dinner, the policy's signature, the sudden displays of wealth. Each detail fit into a pattern that told the story of a man willing to gamble his father's life for money. Isolation no longer felt like weakness. It became strength, the quiet space where truth sharpened into a blade. Each day he rose early, coffee in hand, and combed through the evidence with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. The grief was still there. His son was still the boy who once held his hand, but now that grief fueled the work, turned sorrow into resolve. He was no longer the target. He was the prosecutor, and Nathan's arrogance had given him everything he needed. The lawyer returned with lab results sealed in an envelope. Inside was the confirmation he had been waiting for. The residue was poison, the same compound detected in his blood work. The chain of evidence was airtight. "This," the lawyer said, tapping the paper, "is more than suspicion. This is intent." The father sat back, exhaling slowly. For the first time in days, he felt the weight shift. He was no longer clinging to survival. He was holding the noose Nathan had tied for himself. But he wasn't finished. Proof wasn't enough. Timing mattered. He needed to ensure that when he moved, the collapse would be absolute. He contacted an old colleague from his forensic days, a man with connections in insurance investigations. Quietly, without naming names, he laid out the scenario. The colleague listened, then confirmed what he already knew: the policy was real and the payout terms were clear. Nathan had built a perfect paper trail to cash in on his death. But what Nathan hadn't counted on was the father who refused to die quietly. At night he sat alone in the dim light of his study, the walls lined with decades of memories, and weighed the gravity of what lay ahead. Betrayal from a stranger was one thing. Betrayal from blood was another. He would not simply expose Nathan. He would dismantle the life he had tried to build, on lies strip him of the illusion of success until nothing remained but the truth. Each step forward brought him closer to that reckoning. He rehearsed what he would say when the time came, not in anger, but in the cold clarity of a man presenting evidence in court. He would lay it out piece by piece: the toxicology, the insurance, the debts, the vial. He imagined Nathan's face when the mask slipped, when the performance collapsed under the weight of proof that could not be denied. By the end of the week, the case was ready. Proof stacked neatly in files, evidence sealed in bags, statements printed and signed. He looked at it all spread before him and felt a grim kind of pride. He had not just survived. He had fought back, built the case with the same precision he once used to expose men who thought they could outwit the system. Nathan had underestimated him, mistaking age for weakness. Now the balance of power had shifted, and the son's scheme was nothing more than a house of cards trembling on the edge of collapse. He closed the final file, leaned back in his chair, and let the silence settle over him. He was ready now. No longer prey, no longer victim. He was the hunter, armed with truth, waiting for the exact moment to strike. The storm that began in his kitchen had gathered into a force that would tear everything apart, and when it broke, Nathan would finally learn what it meant to face a man who had made his life out of building unshakable cases. The father stood, slid the vial back into his pocket, and glanced once at the photo of his late wife on the bookshelf. Her smile seemed to ask the same question his own heart whispered in the quiet. Was he ready to deliver the justice their son had earned? The answer was no longer in doubt. What came next would end the game forever. The morning of reckoning arrived without drama. Just the slow crawl of dawn light through the blinds and the quiet shuffle of papers laid neatly on the desk. He had stacked them with deliberate care. Toxicology reports, the insurance policy with his name in bold bank records, traced in red ink, and the vial sealed in plastic, its residue gleaming faintly like frost. He looked at it all and knew the weight of what was coming. It was not victory he felt, but inevitability, the steady march of consequence. He dialed the number, his voice calm, each word delivered with the precision of a man who had already rehearsed this moment 100 times. When the call ended, silence filled the room, heavy and final. By mid-morning the knock came. It was not loud or hurried, but firm, official, the sound of law arriving to collect its due. He opened the door and saw 2 officers standing on the porch, their expressions professional, their eyes already scanning the scene like men who had heard the story before. He stepped aside, gestured them in, and handed over the files without ceremony. No speeches, no pleas, just truth. They took the evidence, read the signatures, examined the vial. One of them nodded slowly, the kind of nod that meant the pieces fit too neatly to be coincidence. From there, the machine of justice moved with its usual quiet efficiency. Warrants were signed, steps taken, and soon enough the polished illusion Nathan had built began to unravel. The officers drove out to his son's house, a home dressed in wealth but hollow at its core, and knocked on the door with the same steady force as they had his. Nathan opened it, smile ready, but this time the performance found no audience. The questions were short, the instructions firm. His wife's face paled as the first words left the officers' mouths. Insurance, poison, evidence. The air in the room shifted, the glitter of luxury giving way to the cold shine of handcuffs. He did not follow them there, but he did not need to. Hours later the call came, his lawyer's voice carrying the news without flourish. They had been taken into custody. Nathan and his wife were in, holding their arrogance stripped away, their future reduced to a case number and a cell. For a moment the father sat in silence, staring at the photo of his late wife on the shelf. She smiled from another time, her eyes alive with warmth, and he wondered what she would have thought of this day. Would she have wept for their son? Would she have cursed him? Or would she have stood as he did now, with the quiet belief that justice, however painful, was the only path left? He rose from the chair and walked to the window, watching the world outside move as if nothing had changed. Neighbors raked leaves. Children rode bicycles down the street, and the sun cut gold across the roofs. Life carried on, indifferent to betrayal or justice. Inside, however, the weight pressed heavy on his chest. It was not triumph. Triumph was loud, a victory shouted in celebration. What he felt was quieter, a peace tempered by grief, the stillness that follows a storm that has destroyed what it touched. The betrayal had been punished, the scheme dismantled, the truth restored. Yet the cost was something no evidence file could ever balance. His son, his only child, was gone, not dead but lost all the same, swallowed by greed and arrogance until there was nothing left to salvage. The boy who once ran across the yard with a baseball glove, the young man who once asked for advice, the child who once called him father with pride, that boy no longer existed. In his place was a stranger led away in handcuffs, a man defined not by love or loyalty, but by the hunger for money and the willingness to kill to get it. The father lowered himself back into the chair, exhaustion settling into his bones. He thought of the dinner table, of the glass of water that had nearly ended him, of the way his chest had burned while Nathan's voice dripped false concern. He thought of the vial in his pocket that night, its chill a constant reminder of the truth he now held. And he thought of the long nights in his study gathering proof, building the case with the same discipline he had taught himself decades earlier. Every step had led here to this quiet morning when the law finally closed its grip. There was relief in knowing the story would not end with his silence. Relief that no one could call him paranoid, that no one could dismiss the ache in his chest as age or chance. The truth was undeniable now, carved into evidence, sealed in reports confirmed by law. And yet the relief was heavy, weighted with sorrow. Because justice does not heal the wound of betrayal. It only ensures the knife will not strike again. As evening fell, he stepped onto the porch, the December air sharp in his lungs. The street was quiet, the light fading into the horizon. He looked up at the darkening sky and let the silence settle. There would be no celebration, no victory toast, no satisfaction in the downfall of his own son. Only this, the knowledge that he had survived, that he had stood against betrayal and not fallen, that he had preserved the truth when everything around him tried to bury it. He sat for a long time listening to the night, the quiet broken only by the rustle of leaves and the distant sound of a dog barking. The house behind him felt emptier than it ever had, filled with ghosts of memories that would never return. But within that emptiness was also a strange kind of peace. The storm had passed. Justice had been done. And though grief would remain gnawing quietly at the edges of his heart, he had reclaimed something greater, the right to his own life, the dignity of survival, and the proof that even in the face of betrayal, he had not yielded. When he finally rose, he glanced once more at his wife's photograph inside the window. Her smile seemed softer in the dim light, her eyes carrying the same strength he had needed to see this through. He nodded once, a silent promise that it was finished. Tomorrow would bring headlines, trials, consequences. But tonight there was only silence, heavy and final, and the quiet, cold peace of justice fulfilled. Betrayal is a wound that cuts deeper than any knife, and when it comes from within one's own family, it can feel unbearable. Yet this story reminds us that truth and discipline are powerful weapons even in the face of heartbreak. Age is not weakness. It is wisdom sharpened by experience, the ability to see patterns others ignore, and the strength to remain calm when everything inside screams for panic. Trust is precious, but blind trust can be dangerous. We must balance love with awareness and kindness with caution. For older adults especially, this is a lesson in protecting not only your finances and health, but also your dignity. It is never too late to take control of your own story, to gather strength from years of resilience, and to hold others accountable for their actions, even those closest to you. Justice may not erase grief, but it restores balance and reclaims power that betrayal tries to steal. If this message resonates with you, share your thoughts in the comments and tell us how you protect your own dignity and wisdom. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful life lessons and stories that remind us respect, justice, and truth always matter.